everyone, my name is Heidi and today we're going to be discussing race, class, and gender in America. Since the foundations of America, there have been three main factors that have had an influence in evolution within the American society. I'd like to start with race because I think that skin color was one of the first distinctions in America. According to History.com, the first African slaves were brought to the U.S. in the year 1619. Yes, that old. Slaves were taken from their countries, forced to serve their master. They were put on ships and taken to America in the worst possible conditions. These conditions are reflected in the following quote from Alexander Falconbridge's account of the slave trade, where he says, "The place allotted for the sick Negroes is under the half-deck, where they lie on the bare planks. By these means, those who are emaciated frequently have their skin and even their flesh entirely rubbed off by the motion of the ship, from the prominent parts of the shoulders, elbows, and hips, so as to render the bones quite bare." We can understand how badly Africans were treated to then come to this world that they didn't know and to serve a master who's a person that, because it's on a privileged social class and can own another human being, just own him. And you know, this person was free on his or her land weeks ago, and now he just has to start serving another human being just because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lives of slaves was hard and full of injustice. Masters used them as if they were objects. In the eyes of the master, slaves were not human. With the abolition of slavery in 1865, slaves were free, but I mean, there was a different meaning between the word free for white and black people. Race discrimination didn't end with the end of slavery. If we analyze the evolution of class and race in the 20th century and take a close look at the Great Depression of 1929, where the economy was in decline, many businesses went bankrupt, many people lost their jobs, and the economy simply crashed. This period was really hard for the American people, but we can understand also how it had an interesting influence in the way different races interacted. If we look at Studs Terkel's Great Depression interview in his first act, he says, "I remember when the times were so hard, the sheriff pawned the radio to my father for $10. This was a white sheriff, a white official, that had to come to a black man to get $10. On this part of the interview, we don't only see the economic crisis that the country was going through, but also how racial discrimination against African Americans was still a big part of the society. But the crisis was so hard that white people had to forget about racial problems, at least when it was to their convenience. The so-called nigger was seen as inferior for many years. We can see how almost 100 years after the abolition of slavery and 35 years after the Great Depression, James Baldwin in his clip Who's the Nigger mentions, "Now here in this country, we've got something called a nigger. We have invented the nigger. I didn't invent him. White people invented him. I've always known. I had to know by the time I was 17 years old. What you were describing was not me. And what you were afraid of was not me. It has to be else. Something you were afraid of. You invested with me. The only way to get through life is to know the worst things about it. I've learned this because I had to learn it. But you still think, I gather, that the nigger is necessary. Well, he's unnecessary to me, so he must be necessary to you. So I give you your problem back. You're the nigger, baby. It isn't me." The idea of African Americans as inferior and evil human beings was so intrinsic in the core of the American society that the suffering and injustice didn't stop when Africans were left alone in their countries and not obligated to do the jobs that white people didn't want to do. No, it didn't stop when the white people were forced to stop making these human beings work until death if necessary. It continued for years. I mean, recently in the 60s and 70s with the civil rights movements, there was a great change in the perception of African Americans, or at least luckily right now there's no difference in civil rights based on skin color, but there's still some people whom unfortunately discriminate against it. Another big factor in the evolution of the American society was class. Class in America had a different evolution based on race and gender. Because we've already discussed race, I would like to focus on the difference in the evolution for white people and African Americans. We can see how in the 1800s, in this picture, there was a possibility for white people to show off in social groups. We can see how white women who could wear dresses like this one because they belong to a privileged social class. And we can see the contrast with this sharecropping family in the 1900s. How different social classes were and how different the evolution of these social classes went towards the white people and the black and less fortunate people. In the 20s, there was an illusion of well-being and people start spending more money that they can afford, making it look like social differences are not as visible. And there was a thought that the American economy reached the top, and after that there was going to be economic stability forever. But we saw this ended with the Great Depression, where, as reflected, again, I'd like to go back to Studs Terkel Great Depression interview, white and black people had to resume their differences and hold each other's hands for a short period of time until this depression ended. African Americans had a different evolution as a class. For them, the social situation was harder and sadder than for the rest. This idea of social classes comes with a possibility of freedom, either religious or economic. During the colony and even during the Civil War, slaves were looked at as inferior, as we have seen. And these were looked at as humans who had no right to be free. There is a social difference between people with rights, in this case the white male, and individuals who do not have any rights. We can see this in the article Causes of American Revolution by Rosemary Sagari, where she says, in the southern colonies, whites of all social classes were quick to embrace the notion of liberty, partially because they defined the concept in racial terms. With Abraham Lincoln and the emancipation of the slaves, the paradigm is broken legally, but not on people's minds, as we understood before. The dominant class does everything in its power to leave the recently freed slaves as a second class. These people could never go up and could never have the same social standard as white people just because they were black. After going through the evolution of social classes in America and social problems, one more time we have to come to the conclusion that it totally contradicts Lincoln's idea of America. As Eric Locke mentions on his essay Class from Keywords of American Cultural Studies, Abraham Lincoln was only one of the most notable believers in American exceptionalism. The idea that the United States, uniquely among the globe's nations, assigned its citizens no fixed class definition and affordable boundless opportunity to those who would only work hard and look beyond the next horizon. Unfortunately, this is far from, America idea of social classes is far from what Lincoln thought it to be, starting from race, continuing from the difference between rich and poor throughout the centuries of the country. According to the article Married Women's Property Laws, in taking a look now at gender in America, before the Civil War, married women property laws were concerned with equality procedures, focusing on the appropriate pleadings a wife should use to file a suit, but not altering a husband's privileges granted by prior common law principles. After the Civil War, laws were concerned with equalizing property relations between husbands and wife. The evolution of gender in America has had a long history since the beginning of our nation. In the book The Art of Cookery, the first book written in the United States by Amelia Simmons, it's really an honor that the first person who wrote a book in the US was a woman, we can see the perception of marriage in the year 1798. She mentions an universal knowledge of those females, in this country, who by the loss of their parents or the unfortunate circumstances are reduced to the necessity of going into families in the line of domestics and doing those things which are really essential to the perfecting them as good wives and useful members of society. In this case, we can see how to be a useful member of society, a woman had to be a good wife. Women are not referred to as having responsibilities as citizens, but as having responsibilities in the household. And an important part of these duties was being a good cook. The institution of marriage was, instead of a fair relationship between two people, a concept of property where women belonged to men and they had to serve them, raise the children, and comply with sexual activities. Another good article to analyze will be The Peculiar Responsibilities of American Women, which is almost 100 years after the first one, but we can see how Miss Beecher characterizes how the way women were seen in America in the year 1842. If we compare the representation of women in the article from the one that we saw before, we can see that there was a slight change in the perception of women in society. Women and men were now seen as equal in rights, but always claiming that they had physical and moral differences, meaning that they were not supposed to do the same kinds of job and not to participate the same ways in society. American women never managed to outwork concerns of the family or conduct business or take part in political life, nor are they, on the other hand, ever compelled to perform the rough labor of the fields or to make any of those laborious exertions. The way this manifesto is put together convinced women that they are weaker and they should not get involved in any physical work or actively participate in politics, business, economy, or take actions in society. We can find a direct relationship between the image of women reflected in the book The Art of Cookery and the Peculiar Responsibility of American Women and the essay Marriage by Elizabeth Freeman when she mentions in exchange women duties included sexual intercourse, childbirth, housework, and child rearing. Thus, the term marriage also implied patriarchy, for men controlled the economy and the physical well-being of their wives and children. It implied domesticity for women, who exercised their power in the home only. Taking small steps during the 20th century, women won many battles in their fight for their civil rights, including fair employment opportunities, paid maternity leave, affordable childcare, no-fault divorce laws, and overall they gained the place they deserve in society. However, there's still many people who believe that women are inferior and that they shouldn't be given any kind of power. I'd like to conclude by saying that there's no perfect society. In communism, capitalism, and slavery, there's always a social class that suffers, or a gender that suffers, or a race that suffers. The future of humanity should be based on love and compassion instead of based on hatred and insensitivity, as it has been for the whole history. This is my presentation. Thank you very much.